Hello, welcome to the first panel of our conference, Gender, the Body, and Oppression. My name is Margaret Ravenscroft, and I'm a third-year PhD NTU student. We are so grateful for those of you joining us today, and particularly for our truly interdisciplinary and transnational contributors. Our conversation today spans continents and time zones, academic and professional backgrounds, and approaches. I'll first introduce our panelists and their papers, and then explain how the sessions will run. So presenting first is Marietta Kosma. Marietta is a second-year DPhil student in English at the University of Oxford at Lady Margaret Hall. Her research interests lie in 20th century American literature, postcolonialism, and gender studies. Her paper today is titled Decolonialization of the Body through Shailja Patel's Migritude. After Marietta will be Daniel Fiaveh, discussing LGBT discourses in Ghana. What are the cultural and moral suasions and nuances? Daniel is a senior lecturer in anthropology and sociology at the University of Cape Coast, where he founded the Center for Men's Health and Sex Studies. He focuses on cultural representations of men and boys, sexual preferences, cultures, alcohol, and substance misabuse and abuse, sexual health, and queer lives. After Daniel, we have Ndiweteko Jennifer Nghishitende. Ndiweteko is a second-year PhD candidate at the Wilberforce Institute, University of Hull. She is from Namibia, where she worked in the field of women and children's rights before joining the Wilberforce Institute. Her PhD research is on life after modern slavery, and her talk today is entitled Living and Not Only Surviving, a Decolonial Feminist Approach to Life After Modern Slavery in the UK. Finally, we will have Lede Pohshna discussing queer and ecomasculinity beyond the West, ethics and praxis. Lede is a doctoral student in the English department, Northeastern Hill University. His specialization is in queer studies, working on the peculiarity of South Asian closet and the various modes of identifications of queer subjects. He also focuses on tribal oral literature, post-colonial literature, and migration studies. All of these presentations have been pre-recorded. They'll run consecutively, after which we'll patch in live for a conversation and question and answer session, which we hope you participate in. Please note that the presentations include live automated closed captioning that's generated by Teams, so it might include some mistakes. This panel will run for about 90 minutes. Again, we're really delighted you can join us, so let's get started.
Hi, my name is Marietta Kosma, and I'm a second-year English student, DPhil student in the University of Oxford. So today I'm going to be presenting a paper. 1 second so I can share my screen. So I'm going to be sharing my paper, Decolonization of the Body through Shailja Patel's Migritude for the Building Bridges and Interdisciplinary Conference. So Shailja Patel is a Kenyan writer, performer, and activist of Indian heritage who grew up in Kenya. Her work focuses on issues of decolonization, globalization, and diaspora. She explores these topics beautifully in her work Migritude, a piece intended as a spoken and acted out performance. It is a collection of poems refusing to confine itself to just one single genre. But at first, it was a theatrical production that then met international acclaim. So by employing the decolonial, I attempt to enact an ongoing process of disavowing and dismantling the structures, policies, and institutions of European colonization. I expose how alternative Southeast Asian sexual identifications and formations come into being in such context. There is not just one ideal queer sense of self, as the discourse of queerness falls into a transgressive dialogue of identity norms is challenged, and the strictures of traditional normativity are broken down by the constant movement of Southeast Asian female subjects that operate both within and outside the framework of the traditional home. So whereas anti-colonial movements marked a particular period of struggle and imagined in large part the nation state to be the desired outcome, a decolonial perspective reveals how the post-colonial nation state has often continued to disenfranchise the vast majority of its people. So the term migritude is a neologism, a term that emerged from the words migrant and attitude. The focus is on the racialized experiences of migrants in an imperial framework. This recalls the 20th century Migritude movement pioneered by Francophone and Caribbean poets and writers such as Emerson and Leopold Sédar Senghor. So Migritude is a movement that is against colonialism and challenges racism and values the Black individual psyche. So Migritude claims the exact oppositional politics to negritude, as it advocates for non-assimilationist politics, but one that brings into the forefront the migrant's unique identity. So my rating of Patel's works considers the experience of the Southeast Asian diasporic subject in Eastern Africa with attention to the multilateral exchange that shaped the Indian Ocean world prior to European arrival in the region. So in this context, Migritude reflects on the South. These migrants attempt to create an attitude against the forces that seek to dominate Southeast Asian subjects. So create a framework to problematize the strictures of heteronormative identification of non-Western women whose formation of identity is affected by Western patriarchal and imperialist logic, to expose the possibility for the emergence of an alternative self. So I show how Patel animates histories otherwise obscure towards a larger political project of reckoning with the truths of imperial violences. I demonstrate how the concept of migritude that underpins the book narrative its own mutations in form. So I suggest that such fugitivity in form is a decolonial praxis in itself that explicitly attends to the audience-artist relationship, creating dialogic engagement based on the form in which one encounters it. So the novel consists of 4 different sections. In the first section, titled Migritude, Patel reproduces the stage script and incorporates complementary visual motifs. The second section is behind the scenes, let's say, offering context, and section 3 consists of poems that lay the groundwork for Migritude. The fourth section consists of 2 interviews. In addition to its basis in visuals, texts, and performances, Migritude makes material speak. Catchphrases advertising the theatrical performances included "Come for this Iris" and "Stay for the Politics." So the timeline included represents the historical events of the region that comprise the contemporary nation-state of Kenya, as well as its connections to British colonization and American imperialism. The perspective zooms out enough to reference other regional colonial powers. Laced within the migrant history is Patel's family history, which appears more explicitly from 1982 onwards. So basically, Patel's narrative engages more robustly with the colonial period and its accompanying violences. Sexual violence is at the margins of Migritude. However, being on the margins does not mean relegation to the dustbin of history. Rather, the margins frame the center and draw attention to the experiences of sexual violence that internationally cataloged into the timeline of empire demonstrates how patriarchal states inflict violence upon women. These assaults persisted into the post-colonial period and have yet to offer justice to survivors. Patel's reassertion of a history that the colonial and post-colonial state alike continues to evade underscores the need for ongoing decolonial movements. For even as the post-colonial state has won a sort of independence from its former colonizer, there remain structures of dependence that dispossesses the majority of people in post-colonial nation-states all over the world. So the need of decolonization persists into post-colonial time, making the notion of the decolonial both an antecedent to the colonial movements and an aspect of our continuing struggles for our more just futures. So Patel offers reader access to a range of effective engagement points, including silences and erasures. She offers us wholly new narratives that revise how the historical events of colonialism and imperialism, Migritude fractures how we come to know and how we remember the histories we have been told through the juxtaposition of text and visuals as alternating voices and perspectives in the text. So coming back to the text outlet points to the relationship between women and their role within historic and future oceanic worlds. How can women of the global South often redress to one another? The sari serves as a kind of memorial to the violence that these women have suffered. So the sari connotes a domestic relationship between differently classed women and prompts more questions about the relationship between women of the global south. And specifically, Patel explains the way that she was reared made her bear, for example, a certain stigma concerning her sex. Her mother's attention was placed on the fact that she needed to make up for the fact that she was not beautiful by, that she was not a boy by being beautiful. So clothing in this context becomes highly performative. And we see that Patel makes herself the choice to actually wear the sari. And of course, the performativity of the sari could be linked to the queering of it, which rejects just purely feminine heterosexual identification. So in Patel's narrative, wearing a sari is a devoted practice that dislodges Southeast Asian formation of identity from the heteronormative practices of femininity that structure these identities. So overall, I have explored the manifestation of migritude in the heartlands of the dispossessed. Patel's work signifies a special turn away from the imperial West and also provokes a temporal reorientation by asking, what is the ocean world of the present? Can the kind of networks of cultural and economic exchange that flourished during earlier historical periods find some relevance today? Or is the contemporary moment so indelibly marked by European colonialism that there are no possibilities of relating to one another? I contend that Migritude's decolonial lessons demonstrate the other accountings of South networks are possible. So there is still more work to be done in studies of the Indian Ocean across historical periods, and Migritude's decolonial lessons lead us to interrogate the litany of violence against women across Indian Ocean, colonial and post-colonial histories, including the experience of migrant women today, whether they are international or international migrants. And of course, a different consciousness of identity derives from these multiple movements that Patel underwent from Africa to Asia and then from Europe to the United States. These are some of the sources that I have used for my presentation, and thank you very much for listening to me.
My name is Daniel Fiaveh, and a faculty at the University of Cape Coast, Department of Sociology and Anthropology. So, by way of introduction, the point is that there's a growing awareness of LGBT rights in Africa. The discourse is clearly showing that, so individuals are becoming increasingly aware about their rights to sexual orientation and gender identity. And in recent times, LGBT issues have been highly political in Ghana, political to the extent that, in fact, as we speak, there is a bill under the Ghanaian parliament, to legislate about LGBT rights. Generally, the Ghanaian law frowns upon penile sex. It doesn't matter whether you are in a heterosexual relationship or you are in any other alternative relationship. The law basically frowns on that. And so some people have basically, interpreted that to mean that the law basically is talking about, issues about gay, sexuality and so forth. So as we speak, there is a bill, a private members bill that has been sponsored by church groups and a leading member of parliament, and is currently at the committee stage that is received over 100 memoranda, and from various groups, including groups that are also in favor of people having their sexual life given to them. And they argue basically that it is no business of the state to come and legislate over individual sexuality, call it governmentality, Foucault's concept, and so forth. So that is where we are. That historically there have always been the debate, the debate as to whether sex is a free will or it is socially determined. And anthropologists, historians, and so forth have gone into research, and studying different cultures over time. So you can talk about the work of Sigmund Freud and Margaret Mead to show basically the dichotomy, between the argument about whether sex is biologically determined or is it socially determined. But a profound work was the changing context in terms of showing how society over time, particularly what Foucault will regard as the Victorian era, how sexuality has been repressed and that people found space, if you like call it, in what some may call in what society may regard as deviant behavior, in engaging in alternative sexuality as an agentic strategy, for achieving their pleasures, and so forth. And so Evans Pritchard and so forth have also studied African context, to show and debunk the ideology that, if you like, same sex is a Western import and that it is un-African, or call it un-Ghanaian. So colleagues, Evans Pritchard and colleagues have shown, for example, in Southern Sudan, and so forth, Heskovic's work amongst the Dahomey, call it Benin, and so forth, and recent works by Mark Epprich and other scholars, showing the impact of, social factors, religion, cultures, how it represses individual liberties and so forth on the African continent, and the history that had been shown how individuals, for example, the Southern Sudanese, Zandes, and, located somewhere, in South Sudan and the Congo and so forth, how people engaged, indigenous cultures engaged, in agentic strategies in terms of satisfying their pleasure, to basically as an alternative narrative showing that, same sex or, issues about non-heteronormative sex is alien to the African and so forth. And so, because of the persistent narratives, some societies that have been very repressive and very negative towards promoting individual liberties in regard to sex, have seen some form of repeal or threats from international organizations for the need for them to repeal some of the anti-homosexual laws and legislation and penal codes that tend to affect, minority rights, particularly LGBT people and so forth. And so the core aim of this study basically is to interrogate and problematize arguments against LGBT sexualities in Ghanaian popular cultures based on my personal upbringing and media reportage on same-sex relations on Ghana. So my work is situated within the concept of power, and I draw on Durkheim's issues about religion as a stronghold on individual society, promoting the collective conscience, and so forth. And then Weber's also idea about the powerful role of religion and how it can be empowering and disempowering, basically the sociology of religion. And then also I draw on cultures, individuals' appreciation of how cultures differ across time and space, and how these things can be located within elements of power. Basically, that power can be explained from the Foucauldian perspective as the ability, if you like, to wield authority over another, and Foucault pushes the boundary a bit further, that even the concept of resistance could be an alternative to power and so forth. So people champion their individual aspirations, their individual cultures, as the dominant narrative, but individuals also within a given society can pose resistance as an alternative mode of power relations. And so it is within this angle that I theorize my work. But this work is ongoing. So by way of methods, as I already indicated, I draw on autoethnography and using published works in newspapers, online, basically, largely online, and credible databases and blogs and so forth, which focuses mainly on LGBT issues in Ghana. And so my search is going to be limited to LGBT issues. And so I can vary the search in terms of homosexuality discourse in Ghana, in terms of same-sex discourses in Ghana. So I will use various expressions and so forth. And also in terms of the analysis, I'm looking at the content analysis of the various news reportage that I will get, and also reflecting on my own life as a young Ghanaian. So it's still ongoing. It's still an ongoing process. It's still an ongoing process. But the initial glance of the literature and the data is showing a sign of cultural framing of sexuality in Ghana. And basically, I went into how patriarchy becomes, an indigenous knowledge system that regulates, what it means to have a gender. Culturally, in the Ghanaian society, sex is generally a sensitive issue, and the culture does not, and I use cultures because there's no one single culture in Ghana, and so the cultures do not necessarily distinguish between what is gender and what is sex. They are coterminous. And so, for example, a person wears a gender on the basis of the person's biological identity. And so normally when a child is born, on the basis of the genitalia, the child is given a gendered name. So the child is either called Kojo, which is a boy name, and depending on the day that the person is born, or is called Efia, which is a female name, depending on the day that the lady, the girl is born. And so the society also does not normally accommodate gender transvestism. So basically, a girl who is behaving like a boy will be whipped into line because the script is very strict. And then a girl who wants to enter the domain of a boy will often be frowned upon. And so they have local names. So there is this they call Kojo Besia, meaning that a boy that is behaving like a girl, normally in terms of the voice, in terms of the demeanor, how dull, and all these things find expression in how gender is constructed. Because, for example, in the typical Ghanaian society across cultures, men are supposed to be dominant. They are supposed to have deeper voices. They are supposed to have rigid bodies. On the other hand, women are supposed to be softer in terms of voice, softer in terms of their attitude. They have to be very passive and so forth. But it is important to note that although these binary categorizations exist, there are also nuances surrounding some of these binary categorizations. The society also tend to accommodate children who have some of these, if you like, complexities, because the society also recognizes that people are different, and so issues about the genitalia is very sensitive, and the role of the anus in terms of what it means in the Ghanaian society is often seen to be associated with death and filth, a place for excretion of fetal matters and so forth. But you will find people expressing, if you like, euphemisms and so forth, like trumu, meaning anus, practices that involve anus. Although it is not very common to find people engaging, because sex generally is a secretive act and people would not normally, generally, engage in. The society frowns upon explicit display of sexual activities in the public. It is not clear the sexual practices that people engage in, but we can infer that because the society generally appreciates childbirth, that people are likely to engage in penile-vaginal sex. But it doesn't mean it's the only practice that they may engage in terms of enjoying pleasure. So that objective is still ongoing. And then there is this objective also that I'm thinking about on moral and the biblical ethics about sexuality. And I focus on the church principle in terms of Christianity, largely because the Ghanaian society is majoritarian Christians, and there's no remarkable difference between the teachings of Christianity and those of Islam and other dominant faiths. They all converge on one point in terms of what it means to live a moral life in the society. So anal sex is often associated with sin, and there are often biblical texts that are cited, to admonish members not to engage in sexual practice. But as to what people engage in their privacy, we don't know much about that. And the society is largely very judgmental, although the Bible, the Christian text, normally promotes issues about presumptions of innocence as a core principle of the Christian outlook. That has been underemphasized. The idea that thou shalt not judge, else you will judge, is often not emphasized, and people cite issues about Sodom and Gomorrah, as part of the alien principles that are associated with, if you like, homosexuality and so forth. And so I intend to go into this to see how we can draw on, if you like, church teachings such as brotherliness and promoting neighborliness and love for one another as a core principle, by the church, instead of overemphasizing on people's sexuality. And so I have a quotation here that are often cited, and then the nuances about the citations. The last objective that I intend also to talk about, that I'm still theorizing on, is the political antics, looking at the local versus global, narratives about LGBT rights. As I already had established that the penal code, already talks about sodomy is frowned upon. The law is very clear on that. If you like, call it British common colonial legacies that have been left for Ghana, and successive political parties and individual presidents would, because of political power, will not want to be associated with issues about, promoting gay rights and so forth. And so they draw on some of this. And of course, these people, these leaders also are normally, Christians in nature or Islam, believing in all these church principles and so forth. And so they draw on this as political strategies, in terms of winning political power. So no individual political party would want to be associated with promoting LGBT rights, because of this whole politics of election, who wants to wield political power and win election and so forth. And so you see individual presidents over time react to Western, narratives about the need for Ghana to repeal colonial legacies that are inimical to individual rights, responses from the late president Atamils to current president Nana-Addo to, world leaders such as David Cameron, Theresa May, Obama and so forth, about issues about gay rights. And this is a typical quote that I had from the current president when he was once interviewed on Al Jazeera about the need for Ghana to really look at issues about colonial legacies that, are not promoting, individual liberties as part of the sustainable development goals. And he responded that he grew up in England, and that in those societies, sometime past, people did not, the society was repressive, and as time goes on, went by, the society became very accommodating and so forth, and so forth. So the society became accommodating and so forth. So, there is a tendency that Ghana would, as the individual rights and, groups agitate, the society is more likely to open up and so forth. And so these are some of the admonishments from David Cameron and so forth. Theresa May, for example, said, deep regret moved to Commonwealth nations at the Commonwealth heads of government meeting about the need for Ghana to repeal and other African countries to repeal sodomy laws and so forth, admonishing countries to do something about it. And this is what May have to say. And so by way of conclusion, I'm arguing that LGBT, lives are located in the margins. Culture misrepresentation, religion, and politics are critical forces to LGBT issues in Ghana. But I'm also saying that knowledge and teachings are key to peer organizing in Ghana.
Good afternoon. My name is Ndiweteko Nghishitende, and I'm a second-year PhD candidate at the Wilberforce Institute. Today, I'll be talking about how people affected by modern slavery can live and not only survive, by emphasizing that coloniality needs to be interrogated and that decolonial feminism is the most appropriate form of decolonization in this regard. Now, it has been asserted that people affected by modern slavery should lead full and thriving lives, not merely cope and survive. In working towards this goal, the importance of restoration of dignity, empowerment, and construction of resilience to create and sustain thriving lives after modern slavery has been recognized. Modern slavery, on the other hand, is a controversial term, and due to time constraints today, I cannot go into the details of the terminological debate surrounding the usage of this term. However, generally, it is understood as an umbrella term that includes various forms of exploitation, such as human trafficking, criminal exploitation, and sexual exploitation. A human rights approach, one that views modern slavery as a violation of the human rights of those affected by it, has been advanced by some as crucial in ensuring that people affected by modern slavery are identified and protected. Now, various theoretical approaches have been explored to seek the best way possible for people to live thriving lives, such as the capabilities approach, the agency approach, and the good life approach. These approaches largely overlap, and they all advocate for the ability of people to make choices and for people to be able to implement those choices. They also all identify vision, aspiration, and imagination as crucial for building meaningful life projects. It is largely agreed that the success of any approach to modern slavery heavily depends on laws and policies, and recent research has highlighted that laws and policies are the foundations of the prevention of modern slavery and are potentially the most powerful levers for change. Now, arguably, laws and policies play a large part in life after modern slavery as well, as people affected by modern slavery are subjected to some laws and policies that rob them of their imagination, that enhances their trauma by trapping them in chronic states of waiting or simply denying them the opportunity to receive support if they want that support. Therefore, as Ratna Kapoor tells us, there is a dark side to human rights, and this dark side, its promise of progress, emancipation, and universalism has been exposed as myopic, exclusive, and informed by a series of global panics, especially a panic over national security, sexual morality, and cultural survival in the contemporary period by post-colonial scholars, feminists, and new scholars in international law. However, because meaningful life is characterized by having certain rights and liberties, it is argued here that applied holistically by confronting its dark side as proposed by Kapoor and being alive to the fact that there is no analyzing international human rights without assessing the epistemic violence of monoculturalist and imperialist understandings of justice, approaches based on human rights can add value to the journeys of women affected by modern slavery, as Kapoor correctly puts it, we cannot not want human rights. Rights are radical tools for those who have never had them, and therefore, though flawed, human rights are preferable to no human rights at all. Now, I'm arguing here that even though it is critical to spend time thinking about and implementing theoretical approaches to best assist people who have left situations of modern slavery, a critical aspect needs attention in anti-modern slavery work. So discussions about restoration of dignity, building of resilience, facilitating empowerment, and how people can pursue the good life or any other similar or anything similar should be held in tandem with aspects such as the soft knife of policies that severely disrupt the life worlds of people, as Dazen Kleinman has advised. Especially people understood as having insecure immigration status. Within the context of today, insecure immigration status refers to the immigration status of non-British citizens who have no legal right to abode and work in the UK and who may be subject to being removed from the UK. Some of these laws and policies dehumanize people and must be understood from an historical perspective, especially when political debates on modern slavery echo debates of 200 years ago, as Craig et al. Craig and others have stated. Now, reluctance to protect people affected by modern slavery in the UK is long-standing, and it is clearly visible today in the attempts to shrink opportunities for identification of victims of modern slavery, because apparently, as the Home Secretary puts it, generous safeguards for victims are being rampantly abused by child rapists, people who pose a threat to national security, and failed asylum seekers with no right to be here. However, modern slavery and immigration have long been conflated, resulting in anti-migration policies that fail to recognize why people move and are blind to the consequences of tighter border controls. These policies affect how people with insecure immigration status are treated, impacting their journeys after they have left situations of exploitation. Additionally, migration is constructed as national sovereignty and security problem, and pervasive racism means that anti-migration policies are better received than policies that promote and protect human rights. This is currently being illustrated very clearly in the UK by firstly how government is making provisions for modern slavery in a Nationality and Borders Bill, an anti-immigration bill introduced in July 2021 that will jeopardize identification and support for survivors if enacted. Secondly, how quickly the said bill is making its way through Parliament. In less than a year, this bill is already at the final stages. At the same time, the Modern Slavery Victim Support Bill, which aims to provide better and longer support for people affected by modern slavery, introduced in 2019, has not even passed the second reading in the House of Lords at the time of writing, which is 3 years later. Nevertheless, migration is a fact of life and has been such for a very long time. And migrants do not arrive in an empty or neutral space. They arrive in spaces that are already polluted by racial power relations with long colonial history, colonial imaginary, colonial knowledge, and racial/ethnic hierarchies linking to the history of empire. The migrant instantly becomes an other, emanating from a colonial world divided into compartments, into us and them. Coloniality continues this division in the world created by colonization through various means, including the law, such as the Nationality and Borders Bill, should it be enacted, and establish a politics of disposable life of humans as waste. Therefore, even though colonization has been dismantled, coloniality still lingers. Recognizing coloniality is not merely recognizing continuity, but it is also recognizing epistemic violence and the ongoing hegemony of coloniality of power. The patterns of extermination, pillage, enslavement, racialization, dehumanization, and power of colonization and coloniality are related. So coloniality helps us understand how colonial forms of dominance continue after colonization, created by colonial cultures and structure in the modern colonial capitalist/patriarchal world system. Significantly, while colonization was largely based on constructed racial differences, coloniality goes beyond race and affects all spheres of life, giving rise to new social and geocultural identities. Nevertheless, states, including the UK, refuse to acknowledge this and continually uphold the status quo that is seeing modern slavery as a problem of migration and state security. This way of seeing modern slavery is accentuated by the coloniality of power stemming from the UK's colonial past, which regenerates itself through patterns of denial, erasure, extraction, and domination. This colonial past is somehow remembered ambiguously, with some indications of a form of historical amnesia and even blatant refusal to confront colonial offshoots. Revisionist accounts of the imperial and colonial life are relied upon, as Gilroy provides, which are dangerous and misleading, as they feed the illusion that Britain has been or can be disconnected from its imperial past. However, it's crucial to understand the coloniality of power and how it affects how people affected by modern slavery are seen and treated. Because in order for us to understand the historic roots of contemporary problems, we need to investigate a range of issues and associations that have rarely featured in recent discussions of trafficking, as Quirk or Joel Quirk has identified. Otherwise, analytical approaches to modern slavery will be limited if they do not acknowledge racism as an active and dynamic political force. The oppression seen today, such as shrinking opportunities of identification as victims, is not carried out through blatant and salient expressions of cruelty or tyranny, but it is carried out through the soft knife of laws and policies, such as the Imminent Nationality and Borders Bill. So I therefore agree with Ratna Kapoor when she says that the first thing to do should be to revisit the colonial encounter, to adequately interrogate the colonial trappings and hegemonic first world formations on which law is based, which continue to exploit women and the subaltern subject and exclude or ignore the non-West. This is important as it is the first step to de-link from the colonial matrix of power through decoloniality. Revisiting the colonial encounter is also crucial for understanding the limitations and possibilities of the human rights approach, where questions of race have a minimal presence in today's incomplete genealogies of the global movement for human rights. My call here is similar to that of pure Wallen law, calling for naming and recognition and then dismantling of the apparatus of coloniality so profoundly embedded within anti-migration, qua anti-modern slavery laws and policies, as well as other aspects of anti-slavery work to move towards epistemic change. Because, as Lord argues, the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to, if the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to determine its fruits, only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and allowable. In this context, anti-modern slavery tools, including laws and policies developed within the coloniality of power, will never be able to bring about epistemic change. Therefore, while debates about which liberatory projects are better to ensure that people affected by modern slavery are empowered in the long term are essential, there is a need to have them in tandem with discussions about investigating the roots of the laws and policies that are instrumental in ensuring that these theoretical approaches come to fruition. Approaching the issue in this way allows us to resist the laws and policies adequately and in turn resist the coloniality of power. Without revisiting the colonial encounter, there will be no acknowledging that coloniality is everywhere and remains a prevalent form of domination on the back of which laws and policies are based today. And without acknowledging the continuous and perverse effects of coloniality, there will be no decolonial work, which is necessary to ensure coloniality's dismantling. Decoloniality derives from and responds to coloniality and the ongoing colonial process and condition. While coloniality created specific ways of seeing modern slavery and those affected by it, decoloniality offers an opportunity to employ a relational way of seeing the world. However, it is an intentional process, and as Frantz Fanon identified many years ago, decolonization cannot come as a result of magical practices or unnatural shock or of a friendly understanding. Decolonial thinking recognizes that there is no modernity without coloniality, and modernity cannot be thought sensed without its underside, which is coloniality. And as such, the analysis of global development cannot be done without analyzing its ethnocentrism. On this backdrop, I foreground decolonial feminism as the most appropriate form of decoloniality because feminism itself involves so much more than gender, and this approach can be suitable for everyone, as modern slavery does not only affect women. Decolonial feminism adds to the multiplicity that has been identified by Black feminists, how the intersecting and interlocking of gender, race, class, ethnicity, and many other aspects of identity affect lived experience, and adds an important aspect, which is the coloniality of power, as discussed earlier. It thus recognizes intersectional subjectivities as necessary for liberatory practices and the transformation of human sciences and relationality. Creating a feminism of all, decolonial feminism provides an all-encompassing feminism. And as Verges perfectly puts it, it's a feminism that thinks about patriarchy, the state and capital, reproductive justice, environmental justice, and criticism of the pharmaceutical industry, the rights of migrants, refugees, and the end of femicide, the fight against Anthropocene, racial capitalocene, and the criminalization of solidarity. This is the feminism that we want to employ when we think about supporting women's liberatory projects in life after modern slavery, because not only does it acknowledge the importance of intersectionality and coloniality of power, but it also goes a step further to highlight the question of gender, to unpack the meaning of gender and gender assigning. So, thus, decolonial feminism offers a multidimensional analysis of oppression and refuses to divide race, sexuality, and class into mutually exclusive categories to destroy racism, capitalism, and imperialism. In conclusion, therefore, it's vital that people affected by modern slavery rebuild lives that enable them to thrive and not only survive. However, without decolonial feminism, efforts to establish approaches to support them to thrive and not only survive will continue to benefit only a select few. Many people affected by modern slavery, such as those with secure immigration status, will remain out of the bounds of those approaches. And with this, I thank you very much. I will be here for questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lady Miki Pohshna. I've been doing my research in Northeastern Hill University in Geelong, India. And the topic of my presentation today is Ecomasculinity, queer and ecomasculinity beyond the West, ethics and praxis. So what I want to talk about in this presentation today is about the way in which ecomasculinity is being conceptualized in the West, and how ecomasculinity can be looked into a different framework and different approaches when we put into question the ethics and practice of a particular tribal community in India, and especially the relationship that a man has to do with nature. Now, ecomasculinity is an attempt to integrate masculinity within the eco-critical framework, because what we have is we don't really view masculinity as compatible with nature and ecological approaches, because for so long masculinity has been defined, or rather influenced, by the philosophy of enlightenment, and with that we have a certain kind of masculinity which we call hegemonic masculinity, which focuses on the exertion of power and influences upon the others, and this further leads into the exploitation of women, exploitation and colonizations of nature, of other human beings through slavery, and so on and so forth. So all this problem that we have, according to certain theories and ecofeminists, such as the Bond and Ursula King, they talks and even Simone de Beauvoir will try to link this to the idea of masculinity, and not just any masculinity, but a masculinity that manifests itself through the misappropriation of power relation between genders and between the self and the other. Now, this eco-masculinity, it tries to do away with this incompatibility and this reading of masculinity per se, and tries to show how masculinity in itself can be used in order to further ecological approaches and ecological activism. Now, when we talk about masculinity, we also have to bring into consideration the different spatial temporalities and contexts with which certain definition or this definition of masculinity can be understood. For example, when earlier in this previous slide, I talked about the exploitative nature of masculinity and the hegemonic nature of masculinity, and how it furthers and perpetuates a certain events in history, such as colonialisms and capitalisms and slavery. I am talking this from the point of view of the construction of masculinity through the Western eyes. And it is true that masculinity across all spectrum of context, it has its own problems, it has its own issues, and those issues are very chronic, are very acute, and very intensive to that particular to the context. We must also understand that the long-term effect of colonialism and slavery is much more deep and much more permanent and much more relevant when we understand masculinity as a construction and a problem of the Western society. However, there are certain kind of masculinity as manifested by East Asian, for example, and in these studies done by Professor Wang, he talks about how certain kind of adolescents, among adolescents in a certain British school, East Asian adolescents would somehow portray a certain kind of masculinity that can be viewed as effeminate in the Western context. So really, masculinity is not really just one central term, but it can be viewed across different spectrum. Now, when we talk about eco-masculinity, we talk from the context of the Western critical approaches. We are talking about the ethics and the acts of caring, and how that problematizes the concept of hegemonic and toxic masculinity. Because for so long we have, during the Enlightenment, we have this focus on the act of the self over the other, on the ethics of the self over the others, and how masculinity fits well within that. But eco-masculinity tries to bring the ethics of caring, how man can be a caring being without actually being a destroyer, as can be understood from the lens of the Enlightenment. Now, eco-masculinity in itself, because of that, is an antithesis to toxic masculinity, because it brings back the focus on the caring natures of a man, and not simply on his destructive nature. It recognizes that men actually can have a very important role to play when it comes to these ecological approaches and ecological activism. Now, moving a little bit from that general perspective and general lectures, I want to talk just a little bit about the Khasi community of India and eco-masculinity per se. Now, the Khasi community of India, they are a small community that lives in the northeastern region of India within the states of Meghalaya. They make up around 60% of the population, 54% of the population of Meghalaya, and they follow a matrilineal system, and they have a different place and a different roles for men and women. Now, within this community, what I want to stress on is on this narrative of Ngatpuri. Now, Ngatpuri is a very common narrative among the Khasi people, whereby a bachelor or an angler would be seduced or ensnare or even enter into a relationship with these otherworldly creatures known as the nymph, the Puri, or the river nymph. Now, This may look like just another general, man meets nature narrative, but when you move away from that portrayal and look deeply within this narrative, what you find is that this narrative follows a very peculiar trajectory. That is, at the end, it is always that the man would leave the human world and to follow, would leave the human world and be with his non-human wife. Okay, so this act of marrying into the non-human world, that is actually very different from this act of getting, and this is where eco-masculinity beyond the West is conceptualized. I conceptualize it because what we have in the previous slide is that I talk about eco-masculinity as caring. However, caring it brings a dichotomy between man and nature. That man and nature are two separate entities, and that we can always look at the order from the outside. However, this act of marrying into the non-human by a man, it shows that these two are actually parts of the same entity, and as such, nature can be very much a part of masculinity itself, and it can be read as an extension of masculinity and of man himself. Now, eco-masculinity, according to the Decolonisation, it's not just about the ethics of caring, but it is also about the ethics of identifying. That man not only sees his role within the larger scheme of things as a protector, as a carer, but he sees himself, but he defines his manhood through that praxis of eco-conscious act. What I mean by this is that the very essence of manhood itself is defined through this act of identifying with nature, of being with nature, and of becoming with nature. Now, this concept of masculinity is inherently queer, because since the classing of masculinity recognizes that masculinity in itself it is of the nature and can be understood as the essence or extensions of nature itself, there is an element of femininity in it, because we have many theories, and even the classics would believe that nature would somehow symbolize or is emblematic of the woman's body, and by the man's ability to be conjoined to that nature, to that scheme of things, he actually recognizes that femininity is very much a part of him, and this is a very clear understanding of masculinity. Now, such understanding of masculinity is not a mainstream understanding for the classic community in present days, and I suggest this is due to the epistemic violence that colonialism imposed upon the Catholics' knowledge systems, and how the post-colonial Catholic society view itself through the lens of the colonial father. As such, they do not really see themselves and their masculinity through that lens of eco-critical approaches, but they simply view themselves through the colonial mind. Now, this also shows how colonialism can have very drastic effects, in which one's gender and one's sexuality can bring about a very detrimental effect to one's conception about his role within the larger schemes of things. Now, the eco-man is a queer man who enters into a non-normative marriage to the non-human world. Now, we must not really see this marriage just as another marriage, because it is very important, because this human, when he enters a marriage with the non-human, he is actually trying to disrupt what we understand as nature, what we understand as natural, and what we understood as categories. Because how can a human marry a non-human unless such categories are being problematized and being disrupted? Now, this is the essence of an eco-man, according to Praxis, the one who disrupts all understandings of norms and normativities and the sense of natural. Now, this is a very clear understandings of, and a very clear problematizations of the categories. Now, this reading also is somehow very close to what we call the eco-queer readings of nature and of masculinity itself. Now, when we talk about the ethics of praxis in the eco-masculinity outside the West, we are talking about not only the act of caring, also, even though that is a very important part of it, we're also talking about identifying. And this is the most important part, that you have to identify with nature, not just in the act of caring, but you also identify the self as the very extension of the other, that the self and the other can merge seamlessly within one another. Now, this act of identifying with nature is as much as manhood is the product of eco-caring. Now, it also involves, when we talk about the praxis now, it also involves the rejection of the categorizations of what is natural. Man is not a natural term, but rather it can be purified. And such concept of man can be built through the act of identifying one's manhood with nature. When I said man is not a natural term, what I am talking about the variation within what we understand of a man through different contexts, through different epistemes, and because of that, we cannot really say that man is actually a natural term. It's just a term that we invented for something that we want to classify. Now, this eco-critical eco-masculinity, it can problematize that from the point of view of the Cassis. Now, in conclusion, when we move away from the essentialist eco-feminist critical approaches and toward the eco-queer framework, eco-masculinity can be understood through the framework of the tribal construct of manhood that is inherently queer. Now, what I mean by this is eco-feminists, with all credits to them, they also tend to walk into this essentialist path, that man is outside and the femininity in itself is nature, is an embodiment of nature, and that is all what we can talk about. But masculinity and eco-queer, they tend to problematize that essentialist approach, and they try to bring in the concept of masculinity within that. Now, in this presentation, I want to problematize these categories such as man, and attempt to situate that such categories are not fixed and can be purified. It is not that there is no such things as a male sex per se, but that what we understood by the term man, masculinity itself is a different version, and that is not my findings. Many theories and masculinist theories, gender studies theories, they have talked about this. So that is not my contribution. What is normal and what is natural is thrown outside the door in this eco-masculinity among the castes, and man can only desire nature, but man cannot only desire nature, because when we desire nature, it's a different thing. It's an epistemic identification in the West, but also you can identify, and this act of identifying, I think, is very unique to the Kasi community. There might be communities out there that I don't know that might also produce this, but those that I know, the Kasis, they are very prominent in this act of identifying with nature. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you,
panelists for that.
Thank you, Jen, We're currently having technical difficulties with two of our presenters, and they might be able to join mid-conversation. But if not, we're just going to forward John now, and we'll start the discussion. Okay. I want to start by saying that your presentations and participation really embody the spirit of our Building Bridges conference. And we're really lucky to have access to this kind of thinking through a digital conference. And as my own work it studies gender, I'm really excited by the opportunity to discuss the different intersections today. I feel a personal interest, and I'm quite lucky in this situation. So to start, I'm going to kick off with a question for both of you. Maybe we could just have a little chat around it. And then there's already been lots of questions fielded through the chat. So I wanted to see if you could talk through a framework or kind of conversation about the 4 topics that we heard today, or even just 2 or 3 of them. It doesn't have to be all of them, and how the 4 papers really intersect together beyond or because of the term gender. So how do they all really, intersect as interdisciplinary pieces of work? Maybe Jen, would you like to kick off with that one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. So the first thing that I really realized in papers is that we are all confronting and actually forefronting decolonial thinking above and beyond gender, how we look at people who have previously been subjugated and people who have previously been sort of, for a lack of better terms, left out of the ordinary or the normal narrative of how we look at things. So decolonial thinking and just decolonization of various aspects that affect people's lives.
Thank you. And Marietta, do you have anything to say sort of to that sense?
Yeah, I would just add to that basically all 4 papers, I think that they look towards the concept of the ethics of care, which is like quite a new context because they deal with issues such as, for example, belonging or identity, and how that intersects with gender. So ultimately, like, which bodies do we consider, in our research, if they're disposable, I guess, how are they viewed, and the morality around that. So I guess that's like a very interesting way in which all 4 papers intersect.
I think that's brilliant. I actually hadn't picked up on that, and it completely ties through the thread. And I'll be interested to see how the ethics of care tie through the whole conference, actually, because I bet it applies in so many of the panels. Okay, so let's kick it off with a question from Marietta. This was from the chat. So in the example of clothing, you discussed the sari and patriarchal Southeast Asian formations of identity, rather than framing the patriarchy simplistically as only Western and colonial, which would again center colonialism. How are tensions between internal and external oppressive forces described in the text?
This is a great question for sure. I try to employ clothing in particular in my text to discuss, I guess, this construction of patriarchy, instead of just using the sari as a means that waves towards colonization and just use it simplistically. Because it is interesting that Migritude was not only a text, but it was also like a stage performance. So Patel used clothing in this specifically as a decolonial praxis. So, for example, the sari in particular emerged not only like as an archive or just a repertoire of these memories of violence and trauma connected to the empire's, for example, structures of oppression and violence, but it also emerged as an emotional marker for individual resistance. And it's quite autobiographical because it also, I guess, marks Patel's experiences herself. So by wavering towards this material existence of the sari, she shares with her audience, for example, the ways of just being unfolding her emotional longings and creating a community by making and unmaking these words. So at the same time, these internal and external oppressive powers are described. The sari is just like a visual medium, which denotes, I guess, the start for the initiation of this conversation to actually expose these tensions between the internal and external oppressive forces. So by building, she basically builds a new inquiries and things through this violent history of colonization, which she said that was often, I guess, silenced, and then how she perceives it on the level of the individual.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a really powerful visualization, clothing in general, and then specifically the sari, really. Let's kind of turn to Jen now, and here's a question from the chat. The image of humans as waste is powerful. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that question. So this is a quotation that I got from Verges from her book, A Decolonial Feminism, and I thought it was also really powerful. And the reason why I brought it in is because when we really look at how people or some of the people who are affected by modern slavery are treated, not by individuals especially, but also by the structures that we have in place, by the laws and the policies that we have in place, and by some of the attitudes of some of the governments in terms of implementing policies that actually center human rights and that actually protect people despite of where people come from, or no matter what the person's story is, without criminalizing them, for example. So I thought it's really this quotation was really powerful in the sense that it highlights, especially when we look at the policies on modern slavery, the bodies who are worth saving and the bodies who are not worth saving. And these are the people, the ones that who are not worth saving, who are seen as human waste, are the people who are left outside the parameters of the current policies and the current laws that we have in place. In the United Kingdom, for example, we see a constant linking of modern slavery to immigration. And what we see is that those who do not have secure immigration status are left outside of protective measures. They are left, for example, those who do go through the NRM, for instance, are left to wait for long periods of time, waiting for decisions in limbo, waiting for decisions on whether they are going to get secure immigration status, whether they are going to be believed that in actual fact they are victims of modern slavery. So this is why I brought this quotation in, and this is what I mean by humans as waste. People who we think are worth giving our protection, people who we think are worth the respect of human rights, and those who are not.
Yeah, and I think that also ties to what Marietta was saying as well, just about which bodies are worthy and which are not. I guess continuing on, Jen, from what you were just saying, if immigration status is significant in how we can approach and better the lives of those who have experienced and are trying to continue living and thriving following modern slavery. Are there other political aspects that need to be addressed beyond immigration status? I assume the answer is yes, but maybe you can speak to that.
Sorry, I almost started talking while on mute. Absolutely, there are so many aspects that needs to be taken into consideration. It's not only immigration status, and I guess I speak mostly on immigration status because most of my research, and especially the participants that I've had the opportunity to engage with, are battling insecure immigration status. But obviously, there are also other issues that also affect people who do not have to face immigration status. Nationals of the United Kingdom, for example, who do not have that extra barrier of immigration status, still have barriers that they have to that they still have to go through. So we are talking about things like secure accommodation, for example, secure and safe accommodation, for example, which comes up as a constant problem in terms of people who are just trying to rebuild their lives and move on with their lives. And this is quite an important aspect if you are giving someone or if you want someone to begin rebuilding their lives and starting over afresh, they need secure and safe accommodation. And this is just one of the few things that need a lot of attention. And then, of course, we also have, unfortunately, biases within communities as well. But these biases are not only at an individual level, there are also biases that come from political ideas of how we think about people. So, for example, if a person on the grassroots is seeing on the news that this is how we treat certain people, for example, this is how we treat people who are not so economically advantaged, for example, or this is how we treat people who do not look like us, for example, do you really expect the person on the ground to think any better? Not that I'm saying that there are no people on the ground that think better. Of course, there are various people, but the point I guess I'm trying to make here is that there is so much in terms of politics that needs to be changed in order to come down to the grassroots as well. And so it's not only immigration, it's not only accommodation. We're also looking at issues like education, for example, access to education. We want people to have that access so that they can be empowered to move on. If they are coming out of support systems, for example, going into the communities, they need to work. They need access to work. They need access to training. But if at a political level, if these decisions are not made to make sure that these are available options for people, what are we really doing?
Absolutely, that's a brilliant answer. Thank you so much. I think a lot of what you're talking about is really contesting the violence, systemic violence. It might not be physical necessarily, but yeah. And actually, we have a question for Marietta around systemic violence. I think that really they really speak to each other. So Marietta, in your abstract, you say that the reproduction of systemic violence is questioned through language, and I think probably around policy and governmental approach. That's exactly what you're talking about, Jen, as well. So can you talk a little bit more about that, the use and the power of language in the text in Migritude?
Yeah, that definitely ties into Jen's answer, because also in Migritude we see the violence, for example, that immigrants' families are subjected to. So Patel brings into conversation, for example, her own family's efforts to travel. And there's like a part where she exposes like that they were viewed just as disposable parts because their passports, for example, were not English or American when they were trying to travel to see Shailja Patel herself. So I thought that this was very interesting. So, and because we're living in a time like of numerous atrocities and like senseless death, it is interesting to like think these ethical and political questions. For example, what are the modes of representation available to these people? And for example, Patel's family, for example, it was difficult because for them to cross these borders. So this is like the heart of the very problem, and they were rendered like as a vulnerable group. So this question of vulnerability also comes to the forefront. But at the same time, what is interesting is that Patel is like mindful of the language that she's using. So by giving, for example, these examples of her own family, she's trying to deconstruct the very power that tries, I guess, to subjugate them. And like another interesting way of thinking about it is like through phenomenology. So basically through the theory of time and space, how is their movement, I guess predicated by the specific spatial dimension that they're occupying at this specific time. And then she contrasts this movement of theirs, for example, in the very end of the text, saying that when they had like a British passport, it was like way easier for them to move around and did not face like all this confinement and like questioning. So I hope this answers the question, or I can answer to any follow-ups.
Yeah, I mean, just zooming out of your text actually, and broader towards the form, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit to the ways Migritude's form, which is a hybridity of text, including memoir, poetry, political history, like you said, performance, would you say that's a queering in its own right, blurring the boundaries of genre and making a new space for queer bodies and identities, which haven't had that space before?
Uh,
Oh, I think you're still muted right now. Sorry.
Okay, great. So yeah, definitely. There's the Migritude is not like full into just like one single genre, and this was a conscious choice on the part of Patel because she employed for sure like a theatrical and performance, a text, and then at the same time like interviews, parts of different poems she has written, and yeah, so it is interesting. Like the visual and the text and the performance is what what was like the basis for her work. And then the trousseau of saris, she says specifically that her mother has been collecting the saris for over 30 years. So this like ranges from her childhood, and it was just reserved like for a specific function when she would get married, but she never did. But definitely that's like the basis that on which she was advertising her particular text. So she provided like the potential audiences for like some context about the performance and offering them something else as well. For example, she said like come for the politics but stay for the migritude, or like another catchphrase that she used, if I'm not mistaken, was sorry, I can't think of it right now. Oh yeah, come for the mandates and then stay for the migritude. So this hybridization was signaling to this queerness. So she was, I guess, ultimately thinking that if I don't belong to this specific space, like I need to open up and hybridize the genre that I'm using. Yeah. And this links back to the other question about language that I was thinking, because she uses in the text like English, the colonial language, and then Gujarati, which is her mother tongue. But at the same time, she makes it explicit that through Gujarati, she was not able to express her personal self-identity, words such as queer, lesbian, or individualism. So I thought that was interesting.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That was really thorough. I think I wasn't aware of how self-aware the text was about its hybridity. So that's really interesting. We have a question for Jen that I'm going to tie this chat question and then my own question in together, because I think maybe they work together. So Alan was saying refugees and asylum seekers are at the receiving end of draconian policies that have a dehumanizing effect on them. How can decolonialism rectify this? And maybe you can speak to my question around you mentioned anti-modern slavery work, such as restoration of dignity, building resilience, and facilitating empowerment. I mean, I would probably say those are all decolonial acts in themselves, but maybe you can talk to those two questions together.
Thank you so much for that. I just wanted to say also, I think there was a question here on top here by Trent Deng for me. I'm not sure if you've seen it about.
Yeah, we can visit that one after. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Right. So in terms of the one that was just posted now, thank you so much for that question. So how I see it is that decolonization brings together an openness of embracing each other. Because the thing is, what colonization brought in and what coloniality of power continues to do is this separateness of seeing each other as others, and also seeing this divide between people who are not from the same nation as us, for example, between people who do not look like us, for example. So I believe that decolonization brings this harmonization of let us see each other as human beings. And I think if we start from that standpoint, we may begin to look at more proactive ways of harmonizing and of dealing away with these draconian policies. Of course, it's not going to be, and it is not an easy thing to do, but at least what I am emphasizing, especially in my paper, is that can we at least recognize it? Let us recognize that we do need to decolonize some of the practices that we do. We do need to decolonize the way we bring about policies that are draconian, policies that have dehumanized refugees, asylum seekers, survivors of modern slavery, for example. And because if we do not recognize that, how then are we going to go about the very act of decolonization? So that's the first part. And the second part is in terms of resilience, empowerment. I think this, for me, it's very crucial. Yes, of course, resilience is very important. Yes, of course, empowerment is very important. But the way we approach it and the way we look at it needs to be done in a very careful manner. And by this I mean women who have left situations of modern slavery are already resilient, by the way. Most of them have gone through so much, and they have, for a lack of better terms, bounced back. But they need power, right? And in terms of power, you give people power to be able to make better, not only choices, but even if they make choices, the availability of being able to carry out these choices. And when I look at resilience and empowerment, I like to look at Brittany Cooper's book, I think it's of 2018, Eloquent Rage. She said something very profound there, that empowerment can be a dangerous term, in that it can be couched in neoliberal terms of you need to do it for yourself. It is an individual project. You need to do this, and you need to do this. But actually, it's a structural problem that we all need to look at. We need to give people the tools to be able to perform certain activities. We need to give people tools to be able to move on and to be able to rebuild. And that is giving people power, and not only empowering them to believe that if they make up their mind to have a better life, they will have that better life. You need tools to do so. And that is what I want to situate my research in. As much as we recognize that, yes, resilience is important and empowerment is important, we do not look at them in an abstract way. We have to look at a broader picture of what else, what are the structural issues, what are the historical issues that are impacting the structural issues that people are facing today.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. Yeah, let's pick up Trent's question, and then that will be the last general question, and then I'll ask one just again for you both to reflect on together, and then we'll close up because we're just about at time. So Trent said, I'm interested in whether your research looks at what people who aren't in government or academia can do to fight against modern slavery and address the impacts that it has on its victims.
Thank you so much for that question, Trent. I think it's really, really important. You know, people on the grassroots, people on the ground, I believe, do most of the work, because we are the ones who are coming in contact, in everyday contact sometimes, with people who have left situations of modern slavery. We are the community that people move into when they leave support systems, for example, or even if they do not go through support systems, because not all people who are affected by modern slavery go through support systems, but maybe just exiting a situation of modern slavery and into the community, into a wider community. It is not necessarily politicians or people in government offices that are going to help this person build a community. And for me, life after modern slavery needs to be situated in community. We need to build strong communities to support each other. So the short of the answer is that we need to provide on the grassroots an openness to welcome people, an openness to be friendly with people, to offer love to people, and to offer community as well as support to people who may need it. Because the one thing that people affected by modern slavery may be battling is isolation, and they may be disconnected from their families, they may be disconnected from the communities that they grew up in, and they're starting over somewhere else. And for us, in order to fight modern slavery, one way that we can do is to just give that support to people so that they are not left in vulnerable positions to be re-exploited again.
Yeah, I think it's a practical application of the ethics of care that Marietta mentioned in the very beginning of our chat, which is actually a really good rounded summary. So with that, I was wondering if both of you could maybe just reflect on your own kind of personal response to the Ratna Kapoor's quote that Jen referenced in her paper, which is, "We cannot not want human rights." So maybe both of you, in reflection of your own papers and what we've chatted about today, could reflect on what that means to you. We cannot not want human rights.
I mean, it is clear that it is important to value like a vulnerability and give a place to care. So, because neither vulnerability nor care are the basis of politics right now, so I think that it's important to strive to become like a better person, and so in part like acknowledging our fallibility. So, of course, we need to revalue this care, what we mean, and yeah, it is an ongoing process for sure. Whether it is a political framework or like a different kind of a structure, yeah. But definitely, it's not easy to establish this as a foundation of like just a new politics. But it is important to care for human rights, and especially like in the context of like global communities, for example, in the case of Shailja Patel's work, and those women like in the Indian Ocean.
Thank you. Jen, do you want to add to it a bit?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So Ratna Kapoor said this in her article that she named "Human Rights in the 21st Century, Take a Walk on the Dark Side." And when I came across this article, I thought this is exactly what I needed, because I was battling between the good side of human rights and the bad side of human rights that tends to be universalistic, if that's a word, and universalizing the whole concept of human rights. But unfortunately, sometimes in this process, there are certain people who are left out of this universalism. So Ratna Kapoor here, she says that there is a dark side to human rights, and we need to confront that dark side. And this is the dark side that leaves certain people out. Certain people just don't have these certain human rights, and this is the dark side of human rights. But as much as there is this dark side of human rights is still an important project that we all need to pursue, because without human rights, what do we really have? And so we cannot not want human rights, because she goes on to say, rights are radical tools for those who have never had them, and human rights can actually offer a powerful protection for those who possess them. So even if it's a flawed this project of human rights, it is preferable to having no human rights at all and we still need to fight for this project of human rights, but we need to come to it with an open mind of, right, we do have a history of colonialism, of slavery, of imperialism, and we need to confront that. And by confronting that, we need to be aware that there are offshoots from these historical aspects that permeate into how we treat certain things today and how we treat certain people today, and that might affect how we push out the project of human rights to make sure that everyone is included in this project. Thank you.
Jen and Marietta, thank you so much. I like taking 1,000 notes. I feel like I learned so much, and I can't wait to just look up everyone you cited, read all of your texts. I really am enthused by our conversation, so thank you. It's a shame our other two panelists couldn't make it, but really lucky that we got to hear their work as well and have it in our mind as we discuss this, really, and its intersections between all of our work. And thank you to everyone who joined our conversation on YouTube and for the questions. Really brilliant. I just want to say in 1 hour at 2:30 British summertime, we'll have the second panel of our conference, which is entitled Identity, Diaspora, and Dispossession. And I really hope you both can join, and everyone who's watching still can join. Yeah, it'd be brilliant. So thank you so much again. I really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you for having us and for the great questions as well.